Been tempted. Okay. Not a bad week. We got some rain. We got some sun for the weekend. Huh? Not bad. Firewood's holding up good. New stove's very efficient. Burning about half as much wood as I burned last winter. It's not bad. Huh? Of course, they say this is all because of El Nino, the big flood and everything, and droughts in Australia. And they say this happened back in the 1940s, that the Winter War of 1941 was the most severe winter in Central and Eastern Europe on record, and that the reason for that was El Nino. And we've got him back. So we'll see. That winter part doesn't strike me as very attractive, but it's funny, when I was a kid, class, a second attempt at what? Rebuilding what? The temple and the walls of the city. Now, before we deal with 4 questions that I'd like to ask, tell you what, I'll ask the questions, and you can think about them while we go back and do some history this morning. See, I was a history major and taught history, and firmly believe that one of the important keys to understanding the Bible is understanding its history. So we're going to take some time to review how we got to this point in Israel's history. The 4 questions I want us to ask this morning, and in spite of the fact that they may sound cliched, this week's lesson was an excellent opportunity to answer these 4 questions. How did God demonstrate his protective care over his people in this week's lesson? What role did the prophets play in the demonstration? Does God still lead us as he led Israel 2,400 years ago? And if your answer is yes to the 3rd question, give a concrete, current example. Okay? Now, I'm going to commend a book to you for those of you who are not into studying the Bible as much as we ought to. Studying the Bible is dependent on more than just reading the Bible. You need to know a lot of things, and we've talked about a lot of things in this class. We need to know history and language and politics and economics and culture in order to understand what the authors of the Bible wrote. And I want to commend to you a book that will benefit your study, particularly of the Old Testament, very much. This is a very thorough study. The title of the book is A History of Israel, and the author of this book is John Bright. Those of us in the Old Testament class are very familiar with this book, but those of you who do not attend might find this one a very valuable addition to your library and your Bible study, particularly of the Old Testament. A History of Israel. Let's review briefly how Israel came to this moment in time that we studied in this past week's lesson. Who was the first Hebrew? Abraham. Okay. And his son Isaac. And his son, also known by the name Israel. All right, so now we get to Israel. Israel is the offspring of Jacob, Israel. The man who had how many wives? A great Bible example for us here in the modern age, I'm sure. He had, well, he had 2 wives and 2 other women. Concubines, oh yes. Well, of course they weren't wives. So it was. Did you know that Muhammad, how many of you, even mildly familiar with the teachings of Muhammad in the Quran, you know that in the Quran it is perfectly all right for a man to have how many wives? 4 wives. He can have as many concubines as he can reasonably and properly support. So Jacob wasn't so far off. I mean, 2 of each. How many children did Jacob have? We don't know how many children he had. We know the names of 13, right? We know the names of 13 children, 12 male and 1 female. What kind of guy was Jacob anyway? I mean, what kind of man was Jacob? If you were to, describe him in just a few words, how would you describe the kind of person that Jacob was? An operator, that's a good one. A manipulator. We're talking about the early years now, right? We're talking about the early years. We're talking about Jacob before the age of 60, when he met a man. Do you remember? He met the angel of the Lord beside the brook, and his life was changed forever. Now, what I want you to notice here about a number of Bible characters, just one of which is Jacob, is that while their early lives were not the kind that we would want to model ours on, and the Bible makes that clear in the telling, something happened in their lives that changed them dramatically. But it didn't change what they had done. It didn't alter the consequences of their early life. And that's a very important lesson for us to remember, particularly as we have raised and or will raise children, is that while we may become wiser, we may experience that moment when our life turns around. That does not prevent the consequences of our earlier actions, our earlier life from happening. Jacob's early life was not one that we would wish to emulate. He was an operator and a manipulator. And what were his sons after him? Operators and manipulators. How about David? You know, David's a man who came to that lesson, that turning point in his life, very late. He had to lose 3 sons before he learned that lesson and his life. But it didn't prevent the consequences of his early life from happening. So you see, conversion and learning the lesson of the gospel and drawing close to Christ does not prevent what we have begun in the past from catching up. Something that we often forget and need to remember far more often than we do. You know the little child's story about Cock Robin who shot the arrow into the air. Once fired, the arrow can never be taken back. And so it is with our lives. Once lived, they can never be unlived. And while we may change, life goes on about us as we have caused it to. Okay. The moment of turning in the sons of Jacob's lives happened when? Can you point that one out to me?
Well, sometime before they went to Egypt, but we know that it happened, after they sold Joseph as a slave and before they actually arrived in Egypt to buy the grain.
You remember the scene. They bring back the bloody robe.
I think the father grieved James.
And sometime after that moment, or at that time, those 10 men learned that being operators and manipulators was not where life was truly centered. Because by the time they went to Egypt and met Joseph, they were
Already
changed men, and had been for some time.
Yeah, but they weren't changed enough to confess to their father what they had actually done.
No. Sometimes the whole truth may not be the best idea at the moment. What do you suppose it might have done to Jacob to know?
Well, if it had really changed them, maybe they should have gone to Egypt to find him.
But they didn't.
Well, they had no idea where Joseph was.
According to the
None at
custom,
all.
They thought he might have died by then.
Yeah.
He might have been
At
killed.
least they would have known what happened.
Well, there are maybes and what ifs and should haves. Always are. Yeah. Absolutely. And then there was Moses, man of God.
Changed when he saw the robe.
One act in Moses' life had consequences that lasted for centuries. Remember? Well, that too. But one act, widespread consequences for centuries after his death. Nope, didn't strike that wasn't the one. He struck the rock. Must we bring forth water? The consequences of that act reverberated through the history of Israel for centuries afterwards.
Can I say something? Am I allowed to say something like this?
Of course.
I think the whole matter is that we as human beings need to find ourselves. And this is what the lesson is.
We need to find ourselves.
Find ourselves. Unless you find yourself, you keep going in a circle all the time. But when you find yourself, you stop. And as from then on, you can go on. And this is the example that is being shown in this. These men found themselves. They saw the error. And they were,
Yeah, I'm not sure they found themselves as being the key.
In a sense,
They finally found,
themselves and right and wrong.
they finally found God.
The situation in which they were being placed before God.
Actually, it's when we lose ourselves that we start doing what's right, isn't it?
Well,
Ourselves is the problem.
I would agree with that. Ourselves is the problem, and God is the answer. And God has been the solution in these men's lives as it must be in ours. For Moses and the children of Israel through the period of the judges, we come down to Samuel, the last judge, and his selection of Saul as king of Israel, to be followed by David and by Solomon. And then we have another of those moments in history when the son of Solomon makes a colossal, irrecoverable mistake, and the kingdom is split. You know, for the next several hundred years, there aren't very many bright moments in the history of the people of Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms, and there aren't too many kings that we would have very much good to say about. It's interesting that one of the kings in the books of Kings that is talked most extensively about is Ahab, a king of Israel, the northern kingdom, who had a wife that is still a byword, isn't she? Jezebel. And two great prophets who dealt with Ahab and Jezebel, Elijah and Elisha. But there were a few. There was Joash, the boy king, remember? His grandmother Athaliah, who did away with everybody but Joash, who was hidden by his relatives, right? And then after Joash, another 120 years later, was Hezekiah. Interestingly, Hezekiah was the son of another one of those miserable examples of king that Samuel had talked about so many years before. He was the son of Ahaziah. It was during Hezekiah's reign that the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom, finally taking the city of Samaria in 722 and deporting the inhabitants of the province. Now, the Assyrians were different from most of the ancient peoples and different from many moderns. You will recognize this tactic when one assumes control of a hostile population. In order to control that population and prevent it from doing things unpleasant like revolting and stuff, you remove the thinkers, as many of them as you can reach. Politicians, educators, the educated, those with money. Modern example. Come on, quickly. Excuse me? China. Korea. Cuba. How can you miss this one, people? This is the open wound in America's side in the 20th century. Vietnam. Russia. Cambodia, Kenya, Uganda. The list goes on and on. It's interesting that in the modern age, none of these men seem to have learned the lesson of the ancients. Among the ancients, the pattern was not to kill the intelligentsia, but to absorb them. The usual pattern would be for someone like Nebuchadnezzar, a few years later in Judah, to deport selectively and in 3 different deportations all of the upper classes of the kingdom. All of them. Priests and scribes, royals, the middle class who ran the businesses of the kingdom, and all landowners. All of them. Carried off to Babylon in 3 waves of deportation. There to be, if possible, absorbed into the mainstream of Babylonian life. Not killed, made use of. Because the ancients seemed to think that there was something to be learned from others. We have over and over and over in the Bible examples of this. Joseph in Egypt, working for, incidentally, a royal house which was not Egyptian. Daniel in Babylon, working for the heads of state of 3 separate empires. He a foreigner. Not uncommon at all. These are just 2 of the best examples. The Assyrians were different, though. Among the ancients, the Assyrians were the true barbarians, we would call them. The Assyrians, it seemed, liked to kill. And they did it lots and lots. Everywhere they went, they left behind dead countries. And the populations that they didn't kill as they conquered, they exchanged. So the entire population of the area known as the Northern Kingdom, what was left of it by the time Samaria fell, which had not already been deported, was deported to some other part of the Assyrian Empire and replaced with the population from that other area. We might take Alabama, move all the people from Alabama to Alaska, and all the Alaskans to Alabama. That's what the Assyrians would do. And anyone who was viewed as a threat was killed, just plain killed. Nothing to learn from them. After all, we have chariots of iron. If there's anything can stand up to us. And so all of the people of Israel were either conquered or became vassals of the Assyrians during the time of Hezekiah and his father. Hezekiah was a great reformer, however, who believed what he was taught. He believed that the Lord would help, and so he began to reform, to reclaim. His political objectives are obvious. He intended to reconstitute the old kingdom. He worked hardest, it seems, in the old northern territories, where there were still thousands of Hebrews, Israelites. And he succeeded. You know the story in the Bible. Sennacherib comes and surrounds Jerusalem and makes all of his threats, and in the morning he wakes up to a dead army and goes home to be assassinated. After Hezekiah, the only other bright moment in the history of the Jews is Josiah, another century later. And at Josiah's death, the serious trouble began. Nebuchadnezzar, who was by this time the co-ruler of Babylon, decided that it was too rich a part of the world to leave untouched by Babylon, and so he invaded Judah. Josiah's son was not his father, and so Judah was taken and Jerusalem occupied. And the first deportation of the Jews from Judah, the Hebrews, the Israelites from Judah, took place to Babylon. There was a second invasion in 597, and 10 years later in 587, Nebuchadnezzar's third invasion, he takes Jerusalem, he destroys the city. He's had enough of the Jews. They're never going to be a problem again. He will continue to deport the important and valuable citizens, but there will be no cities left behind. Jerusalem and its walls and its temple are razed to the ground. All of the treasure of Judah by this time is in Babylon in the king's treasure houses. 587, Daniel, that other great political figure of the Bible, begins a 50-year government career. Think of it, 50 years in government service, working for a succession of kings, none of whom are of his people, and serving them well. His example is a model of how the peoples of ancient times worked with each other under the political situation. They accepted reality and lived with it, and like Daniel, did their best, because the king is the king. In 539, though, Babylon fell. Cyrus marched into the city, as you know, marching down the dry riverbed under the gates, the river gates of the city. In 538, a year later, Cyrus decreed that the Israelites should return to Palestine. Let's see, 587 to 538 or 537 is how many years? 50 years? So the exile is not over yet. In fact, the first return to Judah was led by a man that you will not recognize from the Bible unless you have read Ezra and Nehemiah carefully. Anyone remember who led the first return? See if I can catch anybody out this morning. Who led the first return of the Jews? Sheshbazzar. That's good. Like that. Sheshbazzar, a prince. Remember the royal house? He was an old man, probably in his 60s by the time this happened. He probably didn't return with very many people, because 40 years later the population of the area was still less than 20,000 according to the official Persian census. Cyrus was still king. Sheshbazzar was appointed governor. He returns and lays the foundation of the temple. But there aren't very many people. Sheshbazzar soon disappears from the scene. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the careers of Sheshbazzar and his nephew are telescoped. In fact, his nephew gets most of the credit for everything that his uncle did. Remember his nephew's name? Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel probably led the second major return to Judah. Now, you have to be careful with the chronology here, because the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, especially the book of Ezra, is just a bit jumbled. Not sure why, but it's discontinuous. It jumps around a bit. The best chronology that we can build goes something like this, to get this week's lesson in perspective. Okay? I'm going to throw some dates at you. Listen to them, do what you want with them, but get kind of the sequence of events here, okay? About 537, Sheshbazzar leads the first wave of Jewish immigrants back to the Holy Land. Cyrus is king until 522. Throughout almost all of this period, as we find in Ezra. Now take your Bible and look in Ezra chapter 4. We'll kind of try to get things in order in Ezra. Sheshbazzar returns, lays the foundation of the temple, but as we find in Ezra 4, the first 5 verses, no sooner had the Jews returned than the local inhabitants gave them grief. They would continue to do so through the entire period of the next several centuries. There would be constant returns of the aggravation of the surrounding countries and political. Why?
they were put there to inhabit this place, and now these people are coming back saying it's theirs. Isn't it an intrusion to what is now someone else's, in a way?
They were intruders. Think about this now. The Jews were returning to what they considered to be their country, right? Their land. Who was there? Wasn't empty. There were people there. There were those who were left behind. There were those who moved in because it was mostly uninhabited after the third deportation. At least half the population of Judah had been carried off by Nebuchadnezzar, and an equal share had been carried off from the northern kingdom by Assyria. So there was plenty of room, plenty of land. Those who were there and had been there for 50 years considered that land theirs, wouldn't you? If you and several generations of your family had lived in Lancaster on a piece of land for some time, and someone returned from Europe and said, "Oh, this is mine," how would you react? As might be expected,
That's the same thing that's happening right now.
the Indians, we don't have to go very far. We can just go down to Martha's Vineyard and the Cape and Connecticut, and then just sort of move our way west, and we'll have it happen again and again and again right here in our own country. What the face I'm trying to put on things here is that they're people just like us. We tend to take the Bible and make it stories about people who are somehow different, you know? Sometimes more wicked and sometimes not, but not really like us. They were just like us. And the people in the countries around Judah reacted negatively to the return. Why? Well, let's see. Why is it that the people in the countries around Israel reacted so negatively to the building of the state of Israel?
They were afraid that they would take over the country again and become a major power in that area. They got the temple built and the walls built, got a fortified city built up that then they could start taking over the other countries around them, like in David's day and such.
I think too that they accuse people of not being truthfully, not being truthfully in the sense that they had remained there and they believed themselves to be the sole owner of the place, and they consider these people as half-bred instead of they were whole-bred. So they felt it was them, they were the ones who built the temple and not these half-bred people.
Yeah, there was a lot of national or racial problems here between those who went and those who came back, those who had stayed. And we have the political thing. It wasn't so long ago, remember, it was less than 2 centuries since the time of Hezekiah, who had been king of a once again powerful and large kingdom in that part of the world. And not so long that the Edomites and the Moabites and the Philistines and the Phoenicians didn't remember the days of David and Solomon, when the empire had stretched from the Sinai to the Euphrates. And the heart of that empire was Jerusalem. And the heart of Jerusalem was the temple. And it wasn't so big a stretch for them to think that if the temple were rebuilt, next would be Jerusalem. And after Jerusalem, the kingdom again. And they didn't have any intention of letting that happen. Would you?
But as you said before, they were human beings just as well.
Yes, they were just like... what is your reaction, if I may ask, to the claims of the Indians in Massachusetts to 2/3 of Cape Cod? I'm not confused. I'm not a bit confused. My reaction is immediately, hey, the past is dead. Doesn't belong to you. Not so different. But because there weren't very many people living in the province, and they were not terribly well off, you can imagine what happened to the building of the temple, especially in view of the fact that the surrounding peoples didn't think highly of what was going on. It didn't take very long for the people who had returned from Babylon to begin to think that before they did something like building the temple, maybe they should get their own lives back together. You know, before we build that new church, maybe we ought to pay off the mortgage and, you know, finish the car payments. And we do need a new television and VCR in the den. Well, the old ones, you know, snow on the, you know, I mean, really, you know, I mean, home first and then not so different. In Ezra 2, we have the story of Zerubbabel, who leads the second great wave of immigration back to the Holy Land. And subsequent to this return, we have the rebuilding of the temple and its completion. Do you remember how long it took to build Solomon's temple? About 7 years. It was, and probably still is, one of the most magnificent structures ever built by man. How long did it take to build the second temple? 4.5 years. It was as great a building as they could make it. It was, to the extent that they were able, a carbon copy of the first. Remember that Cyrus had ordered that the treasure of the kingdom, specifically of the temple, which was the heart of the kingdom, be returned along with the people. And so we believe that the second temple, if not quite what Solomon's temple had been, was some building. Okay, here comes Zerubbabel with a new wave of people. They're all excited and enthusiastic about returning. One can expect them to get a lot of work done very quickly, and that's just what they did. The temple was dedicated in 515. Most of the dates that we work with from the time of Cyrus on are pretty clear, because we don't have to find them in the Bible where it's difficult to pick them out sometimes. They're found in the records of the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persian Empire, in Egypt, in Syria and Assyria. The records are very complete. 515. In Ezra 5, verse 3, and in chapter 6, verse 15, that whole section, chapters 5 and 6, most of 5 and 6, what we studied for this week's lesson is the story of the politics of that period, right there. Who was Tatnai? Did anyone find out who Tatnai was? Besides being a pain in the neck. He was the satrap of the Persian province Abar Nahara, beyond the river. Now don't get confused. Remember, the capital of Persia is, let's see, wait a minute, we have to get this right for you people. Let's see, the Mediterranean Sea is here, Palestine is here, desert is here, over here is Mesopotamia, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers coming up this way. Where was the capital of the Persian Empire? Over here. So where was beyond the river? Over here. Palestine, Syria. In fact, it was the whole territory beyond the Euphrates, Syria and Palestine. This was the buffer province of the Persian Empire between it and sometimes powerful Egypt. Okay? It was also one of the wealthiest provinces historically of the empires because of the presence of the Jews. Moneymakers par excellence in the history of the Bible in that time period. These are the people who had the money. It seemed like their veins were half filled with blood and half with gold. And everywhere they went, it followed them. The ancient empires were very careful with the Jews. They liked them while they hated them, because they made the empires rich. Of course, we're much wiser than that these days. First of all, we're not prejudiced toward Jews. Certainly not toward their ability to accumulate wealth. In that way, we're different from the ancients. Aren't we? So Tatnai was satrap of the province beyond the river. Now remember, from the Israelites' point of view, beyond the river was in the other direction. Beyond the river was east, but beyond the river for the Persians was west. Okay, so Tatnai was governor of the province. He was the satrap, which was far more than a governor, Roy, as you know. The satrap was a mini emperor. We would call him today, with great accuracy, well, let's see, what's that fellow's name? Mohammed Farah Aidid. We might call, and with accuracy, we would call Tatnai the official warlord of the West. We somehow have the feeling that the system of feudal government came into being in the Middle Ages in Europe, because that's the roots of where most of us came from. But the feudal system of government was in place long before there were knights and a round table. The feudal system of government goes well back as far as we can see into history. And it was the core of the Persian Empire's system of government. Outside the city of Persepolis and the provinces, the royal provinces of Persia, the satraps were the emperor in every meaning of the word. And when the emperor went to war, his armies were composed of the armies of the satraps. So Tatnai was not just some guy down there in Palestine. He was the man. And this other fellow we read about, this Shethar-Boznai, was Tatnai's Secretary of State or Prime Minister, would probably be a an accurate picture. From 515, we run through another period of trouble. Actually, we go through a good period because following Darius, Hystaspes, who was the king in Persia during this period, he's followed in office by a Bible Persian king who had a Jewish wife, Ahasuerus and Esther. To the Persians, this was Xerxes. Following Xerxes, and in fact, even during Xerxes' time, during the time of the king with the Jewish queen, if you take a look in Ezra 4, verse 6, there's trouble again. Interesting thing is that throughout this entire period, after the return, the trouble never stops. Even during the time of those kings who made decrees favorable to the Jews, there was still opposition from the local inhabitants, the local countries, and the politicians around. Again, is it so difficult to understand? Just like us. The successor to Xerxes, actually his assassinator, was a guy named Longimanus, Artaxerxes I. He didn't particularly care for the Jews, and the situation by this time had gotten so bad in the area around Jerusalem where most of the Jews were concentrated that they decided on their own to rebuild the city walls to provide defense in case they were attacked. And the local inhabitants said, uh-oh, they got the temple up, we couldn't stop it. Didn't I tell you so? Finish the temple, what comes next? They build a city, and then we're in real trouble. So they immediately contacted the emperor. This story is in Ezra 4, in verses 7 through 23. This was in last week's lesson, although we didn't touch on it very much. The local authorities wrote to Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes looked in the records and he said, yeah, these Jews are a troublesome bunch. And, if they rebuild that city, I'm probably going to have to go down there sometime and knock it down again. So, I hereby decree, stop building the city, or else. They stopped building the city. What else could they do? But Artaxerxes had forgotten something very important. He had Jews working for him too. You see, they all did. He had Jews and Egyptians and Philistines and Hittites and Medes, and he had all sorts of people working for him. Do you remember when Joseph was in prison with the Pharaoh, that there were two very important people that were in prison with him? What were those people? Do you remember who they were?
The baker and the butler.
The butler and the baker. The candlestick maker. No. The butler and the baker. Well, what we're actually talking about is the people who, one was the king's chamberlain, the other was the king's, he was in charge of the king's diet. It was his responsibility to see to it that the king was not poisoned. Had a very simple job. It was probably very heavy. Because it was his job and the job of those who worked on his staff to taste everything the king ate and drank. It must have been awful to be the king because he didn't get a hot meal very often. No, it's true, This was true right on into the 18th century in Europe. They didn't get hot meals very often because the meals were prepared, tested, and then, after sufficient time had elapsed to make certain that the tester hadn't been poisoned, consumed by the king. And guess who was Artaxerxes' poison tester? Nehemiah, king's cupbearer. One of his responsibilities was the king's diet. When Nehemiah heard about the decree, he went to the king and said, now mind you, this is Persia. You remember how Persia worked? Once law, always law. Right? And how about going to see the king? Didn't do that. Why? What happened if you did? That's right. Unless the king invited you, you lost your head. One way or another, Nehemiah got to his boss and said, you know, boss, there's a problem here. You didn't hear the whole story. The upshot of the episode was that the king issued another decree. He made Nehemiah governor of a brand new province. For the first time, Jerusalem and its environs would be known as Judah, and Nehemiah was governor. Now, we know from the records of the Persian Empire that Nehemiah was apparently not only important but well liked by the king, because the king didn't send him back to stay. He gave him leave of absence to return. We think probably for 4 or 5 years, which Nehemiah managed to extend probably repeatedly until he had been there for 12 years. After which the king finally apparently said, no, want you back. He went back to the capital. He whined and begged and pleaded, apparently, and the king probably got tired of hearing it and let him go back again for another 10 years. During which time Ezra comes on the scene to finish the job of getting the city rebuilt and the core of God's kingdom, not the city walls and the political empire of David, but the spiritual kingdom of God's people back on its feet. Now, this week's lesson was about something very simple. A couple of things. Go back to the lesson and study those Bible texts again. We don't succeed without God. It's very plain from the stories in Ezra and Nehemiah that they never seemed quite to learn that lesson. We, however, are much wiser than they. Have a good Sabbath.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Sabbath school this morning. And we'd like to begin by singing number 576 from your hymnal. We'll sing all 3 verses of number 576. Awake, awake to love and work, the lark is in the sky. The friends are wet with diamonds dew, the world's awake to cry. Their blessed blessings on the Lord of life as he goes meekly by. Come, let thy voice be one with theirs, shout with their shout of praise. See how the giant sun soars up, great Lord of years and days. So let the love of Jesus come and set thy soul ablaze. To give and give and give again what God hath given thee, to spend thyself nor count the cost, to serve right gloriously. The God who gave all worlds that are, and all that are to be. Number 537 for our opening song, 537. Please stand with me as we sing together. We'll sing the first and the fourth stanza, 537. He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort fraught. Whate'er I do, where'er I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. He leadeth me, by his own hand he leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by his hand he leadeth me. And when my task on earth is done, when by thy grace the victory's won, in death's cold wave I will not flee, since God through Jordan leadeth me. He leadeth me, by his own hand he leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by his hand he leadeth me.
This morning, as we look out at the beautiful nature and color of God, I would like to share with you a prayer in the form of a poem this morning. Shall we bow our heads? O Father of the harvest, hear this, our thankful prayer. For all the precious ingathering of bounty everywhere, the sown seed has sprouted forth, the crop has appeared, the wheat is garnered, tears cast off for this another year. O Father of the harvest, keep us within thy fold, that we may be the wheat, not tears, at the ingathering of souls. Let all the people say, Amen.
Good morning. Welcome to Sabbath School. Welcome to the opportunity to express our appreciation to women in the ministry and the ministry of women. Many years ago, we might not have spent as much time focusing on that, and it was difficult in years past for society or congregations as a whole to acknowledge the importance and the characteristics that are brought to worship because of women's influence. I'd like to share with you a poem by an unknown author that speaks of the way things used to be to some degree. Grandmother, on a winter's day, milked the cows and fed them hay, slopped the hogs, saddled the mule, and got the children off to school. Did a washing and mopped the floors, washed the windows and did some chores. Cooked a dish of home-dried fruit, pressed her husband's Sabbath suit. Swept the parlor, made the bed, baked a dozen loaves of bread. Split some firewood and lugged in enough to fill the kitchen bin. Cleaned the lamps and put in oil, stewed some apples she thought might spoil. Churned the butter, baked the cake, then exclaimed, "For goodness sake, the calves have got out of the pen." Went out and chased them in again. Gathered the eggs and locked the stable, back to the house and set the table. Cooked the supper, that was delicious, and after, washed all the dishes. Fed the cat and sprinkled the clothes, mended a basket full of hose, then opened the organ and began to play When You Come to the End of a Perfect Day. Now, I didn't come from a generation where my mother did those things, or even my grandmother. Well, yes, I can say my grandmother did a lot of those things. My generation was, my mother was working outside of the home at an 8 to 5 type of job, and I came home from school not seeing my mother. Sometimes I was with my sisters, responsible for getting supper ready so that when everybody came home from work, we'd all have supper together. Today, in our church, there are many opportunities for women to be more vocal, more involved, and to spread more influence on the whole worship experience and the whole direction that our church goes in. Without going into many details, we know of certain ones like Ellen White and other women in the past who were really pioneers of our church and laid the foundation for our church as we know it today. This morning, we've tried to employ as many as possible in the Sabbath school to demonstrate some of the different ways that women are involved in the program today. Other things that are affecting us today as to why our whole experience is different are certain trends. I'd like to just share with you some of these trends. The emerging common market with free trade between U.S., Canada, and Mexico has wide-range economic, cultural, and social impact on our continent. In 1900, 90% of all Americans in the U.S. lived or worked on farms. Today, the figure is 2.5%. 51% of the people in the United States live in 39 cities with a population of 1 million or more. The fastest growing group in the U.S. is turning 50 years of age. Islam is now the fastest growing religion in the United States. Some of these things are implications for the ministry, and here are a few of those. The relentless urbanization of North America and the consequent internationalization of the cities. We can experience that right here in the college community. There are a lot more people from other countries with other cultures that make up the college community, and as a result make up our church group, church congregation. The ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor, and the consequence of internationalized poverty, that is the crushing poverty of spirit. There have been some very noteworthy experiences over the last couple of years which has brought to light some of the difficulties of the large cities, of certain ethnic groups in the certain areas of the cities, and the fact that right now our economy and our societal structure doesn't allow for more, shall we say, an even spread of things. And unless there's some way to address this and change that, we're going to continue to experience the difficulties that come from that. Children's issues, fetal alcohol syndrome, crack and cocaine addiction, homelessness, gangs, drugs at school. Many of you may not realize, but I live in Bedford, New Hampshire. A neighboring town is Goffstown, New Hampshire. And it's in the news right now because it's nicknamed Suicide High. They've had 5 student suicides in a period of 2.5 years, or 2 years, I believe. And it's finally reached the level where they're having meetings with the parents and other people in the community. The news media shows up on the school grounds. They have for, I think, 3 out of 5 days this week. And I happen to work with, on my job, with a student that goes there, and he was explaining his side of things. But even so, for teenagers to feel that suicide is the answer to their problems is a tragic testimony to what we're doing with our society today. We don't obviously have the time today to go into how the changing trends, especially the family structure and the important role that mothers and women have played, how that being changed, how that has affected us in our society. But I think that all of us realize, whether you had a good childhood experience and a good home life, or if you didn't, you realize today the importance of that. Some of the growth trends, or some of the ways to overcome these changes, is the growth of small group movements, therapy groups, self-help groups, homeschooling, house churches. These are indicative of the needs for intimacy and control. That's 2 of the things that I'd like to emphasize in today's short period, is that there's a need, and I think that need has been addressed to some degree here in our own church. There are small group ministries that are beginning, and I have spoken with many people who talk about the difficulty of getting together with friends and just fellowshipping together and sharing a faith together. There's a lot of busy activity here in the community, but it doesn't necessarily always meet the needs of just friends getting together and, say, a cottage-style approach. Cottage meetings was a phrase used many years ago. Their purpose and how they benefited us hasn't changed, but sometimes we lose sight of the old remedies or the old practices and the benefit from it. As we spend the rest of this month touching on certain areas of women in the ministry and women ministries, I'd like everyone to think about the importance of that side of our congregation, that side of our worship, that side of our experience. This morning, I'm glad to have with us today Pam Stiles, that will share a part of her personal ministry in music, and she will be bringing to us Moonlight Sonata. And she has some of her own music to bring with that.
Good morning. This is not a traditional hymn, but I hope that you will find a blessing from it this morning. Come to me, all ye that need rest. Take my yoke, upon you, and learn of me. All ye that labor, all ye that are to me, come to me, all ye that need rest. Come to me to find rest unto your souls. My yoke is easy, my burden light, my yoke is easy, and my burden is light, is light. Oh, come to me, and ye shall find your rest. Come to me.
Thank you, Pam. That was very nice. As I said earlier, there are many things that we would like to do, but the time limits us. As we go through this week, I would like you to think about your position, your responsibility as a woman in this church, as a member of this church, and those of us that do not fall in that category, let's think about the importance that the women play in the ministry of our church and in the ministry of our congregation. Next week, Nyla Salisbury will be with us, and she will present some of her experience as she supports Pastor Salisbury in his ministry, and we will have a chance to see what it's like to be the behind-the-scenes individual supporting the one that seems to always be in the limelight or in the front. Thank you for joining us for Sabbath School today. Shall we bow our heads as we have closing prayer? Father in heaven, I thank you for the opportunity to become more sensitive to our experiences as human beings in this world, and especially as committed Christians in this world as we know it. As each day goes by, may we be more sensitive to the moving of the Holy Spirit, that we here in this area can fulfill the destiny that you have in mind. And may the world know as they meet with us that we have met with you. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.